It is another wonderful adventure in podcasting. This is Words, Images, and Worlds, and I am joined on this episode by Dr. Miriam Mora. May I call you Miriam, Dr. Mora? How would you like me to address you?
Miriam is just fine, thank you.
All right. Delighted to have you, and we have Bruce Willis from Sin City joining us as well. There he is. Uh, we've been talking about fandom. We've been talking about voice acting and all sorts of things. And I know that you're an author and a scholar, and I am curious about your background and how you connected to these areas of research.
Certainly. Well, thank you for having me on. It's very exciting to
Glad to
talk
have
with
you.
you.
Thank you.
Um,
Thank you.
I started my journey towards scholarship as a high school dropout artist, and then I got a couple of degrees in photography and became a technician. And I thought, this is it. I'll do photography forever. I worked in a color darkroom. Um, And if you've ever worked in a color darkroom, it means you were involved in photography before digital. So when digital became quality enough, I became a dinosaur overnight. And I thought, okay,
Mhm.
so photography's over for me. What else can I do? What else do I enjoy? And I ended up going back to school for my master's degree in Holocaust and Genocide Studies to study representation of tragedy in film and
Oh,
uh
wow.
and yeah, it was a depressing few years, I'm not gonna lie. But I loved it. I loved the process and I loved the scholarship, and I wrote my master's thesis uh about the what I identified as the six major Holocaust related films of 2008. And
Mm-hmm.
what I learned, and those, gosh, I don't even know if I could rattle them all off now. But if you're interested, I'll try. But what I really found in this research was that although the hundreds of Holocaust films that I'd watched while I was writing this, from the previous 50 years, were really kind of relatively predictable in who was going to be the villain and who was going to be the victim. In 2008, there was a change happening, and Jews were being represented as more complex, and not always as the good guys. And similarly, Nazis and Germans, but also Nazis, were being represented not necessarily as the bad guys, but as complex human figures. And I thought, this is good progress, but going too fast and in a kind of frightening direction. And then Inglorious Bastards came out, and I was
Mm-hmm.
like, yes,
Mm-hmm.
that's why. um, so I ended up, focusing on the masculinity aspect and saying, like, what is it about Jewish men that's really changing in these films, and why? And I started looking into it, and I found that every other scholar who'd written about Jewish masculinity had written about film because that's where it tends to show up, but that there was no actual history about Jewish masculinity that talked about the ways in which Jewish men actually, in reality, perform gender. So I went back to school again, this time for my PhD in immigration and ethnic history, and refocused on, focused on Jewish men, but specifically through this lens of gender and migration, because I believe that it is largely through the process of acculturation, of attempting to become American, that we can really track Jewish masculinity changing in very intentional ways, and it tells us a lot about Jewish history on the whole and Jewish identity. So that's how I got into that, and that's what the
Very
book
interesting.
the book is on. Yeah.
Yeah, we have some connections. I was a high school dropout. Also made my way around to a PhD, and I did my dissertation in, it wasn't a specific kind of film, although films about the Holocaust were part of it, but film as a text and how teachers were using it that way in the classroom and unpacking
Yes.
it and building around the standards and things like that with film. So we have some connections I didn't realize.
You don't meet a whole lot of high school dropouts with doctorates, so it's nice to know you, Jason.
Yeah. Nice to meet you as well. It's like the irony and the restoring and all of that that becomes part of that. So,
Mhm.
as well as kind of a clap back to the universe in some
Right.
ways. Yeah.
Yeah. Or our
Now,
families or. Our teachers.
Oh yes, yeah. I certainly have some teachers as well that probably would be surprised by that. So,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. The story continues and the story expands.
Yeah. And one of the reasons it was, I think, such a shock to my family, who are very studious, and I had two sisters, avid readers. I mean, the classics and, horror and this, that, just piles and piles of books by the time they were, out of grade school. I mean, out of elementary school. And I just didn't have any interest in reading except for comic books. So I got started
Mhm.
in comics when I was very young. Um, my uncle gave us a few long boxes of kind of his his discarded comics. He's
Wow.
actually recently published a book called Marvel in the 70s, which is really fun if you haven't read it, about those strange days at Marvel. Um, but he got me started on these comics, some of which were really wonderful, like ElfQuest,
Oh
and
yeah, yeah.
he gave me my first ElfQuest comics, which I still have, of course, and but a lot of the kind of oversized, like strange stories, and
Hmm.
Conan, and I think I had a lot of the Nam back. I don't know,
Oh wow, yeah,
great
yeah.
stuff, really great stuff that kind of turned me on to the genre. And then when I kind of, I discovered Neil Gaiman, and then ran
Hmm.
out of Sandman, and then to my mother's delight, looked to see if he'd written anything else and started reading prose novels. And my family was like,
Oh
"Oh my
yes,
God, she's
that's
reading."
right.
So, that's kind of how it started for me. And I
Nice.
I never studied comics until, post PhD, really.
Yeah, yeah. I read them as a kid, and I remember the Conan books as well, and those like oversized, sort of
Tomb
magazine
of
format
Dracula.
books. Tomb of Dracula,
Tomb of
yes,
Dracula,
yeah. I was gonna ask if that was in the long box. Absolutely.
for
Yeah.
sure.
And comics were also kind of a jumping point for me to prose novels, but it was more like film was also part of that. So I would see a
Mm.
movie, read the comic, and then want to read the novel. And in those days, the novel came out before the movie. And so I would jump in and try to know what was happening in the movie before it came out by reading the novel, or, like a novel adjacent to the characters that I could learn more
Mm.
about. So all of those things
Guaranteeing you won't
connect.
guaranteeing you won't like the film as much, right?
Exactly. Yeah. There are always those things that are in the script or the author adds that are left out. And then it's like, oh, well, I thought this was going to start with this backstory, but instead it's this. So, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
one of the elements I actually wrote about in my master's thesis, and I mean, my master's thesis was, I don't even want to say, I don't know, 15, 16, 17 years ago. Is that right? I don't want to think about it. It was a long time ago. But one of the things that I wrote about was this process of adaptation, right? Of like the changing, a couple of the films I wrote about had been plays or novels, and then were adapted. And so I wrote about, how the novel was intended, and then what were the kind of intentional changes when it moved from stage or page to screen. And and I think it's interesting that you bring that up, because there's so much to that, like that process. And I've
Hmm.
learned that I think there's a trend right now. Maybe I'm just observing it, and it's always been happening, where a lot of the adaptations are being done by the original creator, and there's the
Hmm.
change is so much bigger, because they're like, oh, you know what? I've decided I didn't like the way I did, and they have all this liberty. Um, so it's really interesting to me to see how that happens. I just saw the
Yeah.
Cavalier and Clay opera, in New
Oh,
York,
nice. Uh-huh.
which Michael Chabon didn't write the opera, the libretto of the opera, but apparently he had tried. I was reading about it before I went, because they had me do a little lecture at the Met, and and I was reading an article that quoted Michael Chabon from like 10 years ago. He was going to adapt it to television, and he
Hmm.
wrote a screenplay, or he wrote a pitch or whatever, a teleplay. I don't remember what they're called. And apparently the people that asked him to write it and paid him to write it were like, this is nothing like the original. Why are you writing it like this? And he was like, oh, I've changed my mind. And they like fired him. They're like,
Firing
no,
the
we wanted
original
it.
author. Wow.
Yeah, they were like, well, you left out all of our favorite stuff. And he was like, well,
Yeah, yeah. Nice,
yeah.
nice.
Anyway,
Yeah.
sorry, tangent. But
No, that totally fits. We've been talking about like Jewish masculinity and comics and all of those kind of things. And I mean, what better connection than Cavalier and Clay and Michael Chabon? And I mean, what an interesting kind of like pseudo history fiction factotum of like Stanley and some of those adventures, Siegel and Schuster, and yeah, so interesting. There's so much mythology and legend there.
there is, and it is, I mean, you're so right. Catholic play is like exactly the intersection of all the things that I love. It's immigrant history, it's Holocaust history, it's comic books. Now it's an opera. I don't actually love opera, but I do love musicals. It's got magic and
Hmm, hmm.
and it's a counterfactual, right? Like a historical fiction. And I love counterfactuals. I mean, I guess it's not so much a counterfactual as historical fiction. The Yiddish Policemen's Union, which Michael Chabon also
Oh
writes,
yeah.
that's a counterfactual, but just a great piece of literature, and that's exactly what I talked about when I went. They asked me to come and do a kind of background historical lecture at the Met, and I talked about immigration history, and kind of how the Jewish community came to where it was, and what these characters in Cavalier and Clay really reflected. And I talked about the comics industry and how that started out of immigrant New York. And I talked about
Hmm.
Jewish masculinity and how much that really, I mean, really masculinity plays into all the Chabon books, but this one, so much because you have these kind of alternate forms of Jewish masculinity between these characters, um, as well as like, the Lavender Scare and, the kind of
Hmm.
McCarthy era, persecution of homosexuals. And I mean it's all just such great history wrapped up in that narrative. So yeah, it was
Oh yeah.
really special.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about a conversation with Joe Rubinstein where we were talking about Superman, Siegel and Schuster, and this idea of like Superman as Moses. So now I'm thinking about the fact that World War II, Captain America is punching Hitler in the face. All of these interconnections of the history and how it weaves through, and how comics would not be what they are without this history by any
Oh
means, and without this cultural influence.
yeah, not even, I mean, not even a little. I think a lot of people, I think I've heard Joe Rubinstein say something like that. Certainly, I've heard Roy Schwartz, who wrote the book "Is Superman Circumcised," and
Mm-hmm.
co-curated the Jewish Comics Experience exhibit with me in New York, and Danny Fingeroth and some other scholars, make the argument that these characters are Jewish, right? That the superhero genre is Jewish, and I don't actually make that argument, although I completely understand it. But I do think that the superhero genre, just because of who did create the industry and who was writing these stories, the people who were creating these stories were Jewish men, right? Like
Hmm.
largely were
Hmm.
Jewish men. And the genre was created, I think, not to embody a Jewish dream, but was created to combat Nazism, right? And to promote the American dream and optimism. And at least in the case of like maybe the DC, the Marvel threads more than the DC, sorry, Superman more than like Batman, which is much less
Hmm.
optimistic within the DC universe. But I think the characters, the whole genre is like so hopeful by its nature, right?
Yeah.
Like we can be heroes. We can fix things, or like the great will rise out from among us. And I do think that it comes from a moment of Jewish anxiety and fear and pain and suffering and faith in America, right? It's a really American invention.
Yeah.
At least that's my
Yeah.
read.
Well, and yeah, I see so much of that too, and this idea that there's so many characters that are born of trauma, and that idea that I'm going to enact some kind of change in the world, and you have a superpowered figure that can do that. It's really, really interesting.
One
the
of my favorite
parallels.
things I heard Danny Fingerroth say, which I think is so lovely, is he said the difference between a superhero, and a supervillain is that when the horrible trauma happens to them, the villain turns on the world, and the hero, decides to protect other people to stop it from happening again, which I think is just
Mm-hmm.
lovely. He
That
wrote a
is
book on
lovely.
psychology and or psychiatry. I can never remember the difference. Psychiatry and psychology and superheroes, I think. So
And was an editor at Marvel. Fascinating guy. Very fascinating guy.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And a fascinating author in his own right. He just published a book this year about Jack Ruby, the
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. I
assassin
saw
of
that.
the
Yeah.
assassin. Yeah, very fun read, by the way, to all you listeners.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, for listeners that might have noticed, we were talking about juice there. Did I say that correctly?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm curious about how this came together, what your role was, and what people should know about juice.
Yeah. So Juice was this lovely moment in my, in my career where I got to both be a historian, which I am, which is, a notoriously solitary, lonely, and dull to a lot of outside people career, and do something incredibly cool. I was working as the academic director for the Center for Jewish History in Manhattan, which is a really wonderful organization and really unique. It's a kind of umbrella building in New York City that houses six at this point, maybe seven Jewish organizations, most of them archives, so containing collections, and together forms the second largest Jewish archive in the world, the largest outside of Israel. So just an incredible amount of materials. It's where I did all my dissertation, doctoral research. Um, and I was serving as the academic director there. And at one point, a couple of years before I got that job, but living in New York City, I was on the subway and saw a flyer for a Jewish comic convention in Brooklyn. And I like darted across the train. I was like, that's for me. And it had happened days before. And I completely
Ah,
missed it.
yeah.
And I was devastated. And then the next year, I believe, there was another one. But I was very pregnant and simply couldn't make it from Manhattan to Brooklyn. So it didn't happen. But I was like, I'll keep an eye out for this. And then it never happened again. And then I became the academic director at the Center for Jewish History. And we were trying to think of ways to bring in not only like new people to the center, but kind of new content, do something exciting. And I said, well, sorry about the cat. I said, well,
No, no, no worries at all.
at one point there was a Jewish Comic Con, and the president and executive director were like, try and make that happen, which was an amazing thing for them to say for me. So that was
Mm-hmm.
a kind of defining moment. And so I reached out through the old Facebook page and found Fabrice Sapolsky, who's a comics
Mm-hmm.
creator.
Mm-hmm.
He's also a publisher. He owns Fair Square Comics and publishes a whole bunch of stuff, some of his own, but a lot of other things focused on, comics coming from immigrants and diverse communities. And I mean, so yeah, that's Fabrice, but he's most famous for creating Spider-Man Noir. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and he just jumped at the opportunity to do this again, and to do it really differently. I told him, I mean, I had totally different ideas of what a Jewish Comic Con should be than what it looked like had happened there in Brooklyn in the basement of the synagogue. We made it much more diverse, much more open to the public. I think much more accessible, really fun. I think we did it beautifully. So we had a Jewish Comic Con in 2023, and then again in 2024, with yeah, I don't even know how many dozens over the 2 years, certainly over 100 creators involved doing panels, which are all recorded then on the website, creating original works and tabling. And it was just a totally magical experience. And to go along with it, the museum, as part of the Center for Jewish History, allowed me to curate a really comprehensive exhibit on Jews and comics, which was um, I know, probably the coolest thing I've ever done, I gotta say. And it brought together all of the partners at the center, all of those archival organizations. And so the way I constructed the exhibit, I was the managing curator, and I pretty much made giant comic books, six of them, and in each of them was a different exhibit about an element of Jewish comics. And each kind of organization did their own. So there was one on, the origins of the comic industry in New York. There was one on Sephardi comics. There was one on Yiddish comics. There was
Mm,
one on fighting Nazis through comics. Um, it was really something special. Then there was a Jewish comics reading library that I got to curate and put together with some comfy chairs and spinner racks, just full of good books, from Eisner to Captain America to, really new, more diverse titles like Two Tribes by Emily Bowen Cohen and, Spider-Man. I mean, just like anything you could think of. And then I also created the Laboratory of Jewish Comics, which was part of the exhibit. And in that, you could
nice.
go in and do a photo booth, dress yourself like a hero. You could storyboard comics. You could illustrate it on the walls. It was really, really fun. And actually, that exhibit is traveling right now and is about to open sometime in the next few months, in Cleveland at the Maltz Museum for any listeners that might be in proximity of the Maltz Museum in Cleveland.
Amazing and wonderful. And this will be out well in time for that. So glad to share about that.
Thanks. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
gone to a few places. The Comic-Con is going to continue. We haven't scheduled the next iteration. I'm currently working at the University of Michigan, um, and it's and I have a very big job here, so it's hard to organize
I'm
that. But some
sure.
other people are helping run with it, so I think we'll see it again soon.
Cool, cool. Amazing work, amazing artistic centering and community. And I tend to ask about creative process, regardless of what people are creating, if it's a comic or a film or whatever it happens to be. And I've had guests talk about autoethnography, dramaturgical approaches. I'm curious about the methodologies that are most helpful to you, and then we should probably talk about the book as well and how that came together.
Great. Methodologies for which, I suppose that because there's a lot, but I could talk about historical methodologies like for the book, or I could talk about
Mhm.
the museum curation, which are two very different processes.
Um, Perhaps the strongest methodology that's helped you in both would be
Hmm.
wonderful to hear.
Hmm. A great question. I mean, I guess so. In the practice of in the craft of history, right?
Hmm.
Most people tend to, I mean, you pick your subject and your methodologies, and I am, uh, I consider Jewish men my subject, like for the book, for example. But I am a cultural and social historian. So the social history is really looking at organizations of people together, right? So I spend a lot of time in the archives looking at the papers of Jewish organizations and collectives. So one of the things that I found, which really helps guide the study, on the whole, excuse me, is, instead of just looking at what, for example, I can find in newspapers or, opinions and op-eds and things about what people write about Jewish men, which isn't actually very telling. It's just what people think they think at the time. So it can be,
Hmm.
but it's not necessarily what's really happening. Instead, I also looked at Jewish organizations like, social and athletic clubs. I looked at what they were saying in meetings about why they were formed, right? Um,
Hmm.
and so a lot of meeting minutes. So if you're in an organization and you think, should I really bother keeping these minutes? The answer is always yes.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but it's very telling because, an example that I often use is I found some paperwork from two different athletic clubs, right? An athletic club of run by Jews in Brooklyn, in the early 20th century, that was, working class, and then a athletic club, in Upper Manhattan, that was upper class, that was kind of elite. And what's very interesting is although they are both entirely Jewish and created because created because Jews were not allowed in athletic institutions, which I consider kind of a man-making institution, right? Somewhere where you could go and demonstrate and cultivate manhood in America in the 1920s. The big athletic clubs would not allow Jews in. They were considered socially inferior, so they were restricted. And although Jews were given access to way more in the US than they were in Europe, for example, that social element was still this impediment. And in Brooklyn, the recruiting materials said things like, or their conversations said things like, oh, we're going to teach Jews how to fight so that if they get picked on the street, they can punch back, right? And that's
Hmm.
the attitude of the working class in that time, growing up, in kind of competing street brawls with the other immigrant groups in lower Manhattan. But on the Upper West Side, they would not talk about being Jewish at all. They just talked about their success in sports. So they were formed as a Jewish organization, and because of exclusion, and this because it's announced in the local Jewish papers. They've left us out, and look, we're starting this, the city athletic club, right, which is not called a Jewish club, and the word Jew does not show up in their meeting minutes in the entirety of their existence. All
Right.
they're doing is talking about how much they're cultivating their strength and how they are demonstrating to the rest of New York what an exceptionally strong club of men this is. Right. So it's very telling to look at how they talk about their organizations internally. So that's one of
Hmm.
my favorite kind of just talking about like sources. That's the social history. The cultural history is what we produce. So films, literature, the things you and I are talking about, which honestly, it's how I get all my ideas. I started by looking at the films and then I went down this rabbit hole and found that the book I needed to exist to write about Jewish men in films was a history book about Jewish men and it didn't exist. So I went to write that book. But
Hmm.
the ideas,
Hmm.
I think so much of our lives, especially now, all revolve around the cultural product, right?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
in a couple of decades, historians are going to be analyzing this era through tweets and
Hmm.
through TikTok videos, and there are going to be entire dissertations about what this TikTok dance trend, what 6-7 is going to be
It will.
a mystery of the future. Just like it's a mystery to us now, to us olds.
That's
Because
right.
I don't understand it at all. But I do think that it's it's all about what we make, and that then we have to do the further research to figure out what it means or what it meant at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And the book is carrying a big shtick.
Yes, carrying a
Yes.
big shtick, and then
Yes.
there's a subtitle like Jewish Acculturation in the 20th Century or Jewish Masculinity in a Culture, something like that, something
Yes.
history-ish.
All the searchable terms. The searchable terms.
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Exactly.
What was it
Yeah.
like taking your? Oh, sorry.
No. No. Go on.
Okay. What was it like taking your research and then moving it into book form? What was that process like for you?
Hard,
Yeah.
honestly. I don't know had I not been trapped in the pandemic if I would have done it. It's quite when you write a dissertation and this, it it reeks of graduate student.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
there's a reason for that. When you're in graduate school, it's like uh the ultimate version of when you're, in third grade and your teacher walks up and you've done your times tables and they go, show your work, show your work, show your work, right?
Hmm.
The very
Hmm.
farthest extension and extreme of that is graduate school, right? And where there, you
That's a
have to
great
cite,
analogy. Yes.
you cite everything. So when you read a book that has so many footnotes. And as you follow them, you think, "Ugh, I didn't need to do that. Ugh, I didn't need to do that. I didn't need to, you don't drop a footnote in for the date that Second World War ended. I mean, like it's common knowledge or whatever. You don't need citation. And it's that kind of thing where you just have to go through the book with a fine-tooth comb and pull the stench of graduate school off of it again.
Right.
And it's a really arduous process.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of language that they teach you have to use in graduate school to that makes your book unreadable. Um,
Yeah.
really.
The
And a
meta
lot of,
language. Yeah.
yes, the meta, the jargon, and they're like, prove you're up on the current literature. real readers don't care about any of that. Not only that, it makes it unreadable. And I still think that my book has like a whiff of graduate school to it because it is adapted from a dissertation. Um, but I think, so I've recently released the audiobook, which meant that
Mhm.
for the first time, I sat down and read my book. I mean, for the
Right.
first time since I wrote it. Um, and that, I firmly believe this, even though I did this months ago and I haven't acted on it yet. But I really believe that reading my book out loud will be the single greatest enhancement of my ability to write uh, that I have ever had. Because it was, I mean, parts of it, I was like, ooh, this is good. I can read this, And then I hit parts where I was like, oh, I'm never going to write like that again.
Mhm.
So I think it was an incredibly good learning process. We'll see. We'll see for the next book. We'll see if that actually has made a difference. But the next one, I'm starting from scratch. It's a very different
Yeah.
process. Yeah. But that
Yeah.
transition it is hard. A lot of people, I think, um, don't have the uh, gift of being trapped in their house for the 2 years
Right.
that I was. I mean, it was horrible. It was the worst time, but it did give me the push to foam out that terrible language.
And the outlet to do something with it. And what a great parallel to like sports footage and reviewing your sports footage to get to read your own work out loud, right?
Yes, absolutely. Right. Like watching your bloopers or whatever your bad plays. Yes, yes, it was a real learning experience. Um,
Yeah.
I was very proud that I didn't hate it when I was done, though. I thought that was a
Yeah.
positive. I thought, oh,
Yeah.
okay, it wasn't terrible.
Yes. Yes. Well, I have one more official question. It's been a wonderful talk with you, and if we've missed anything, please let me know. The final question on my list is, what are you working on now? What are you curious about? And it's a two-parter. Where can we find out more information about you?
Oh, wonderful questions. Thank you.
Oh, thanks,
Um,
thanks, thanks.
I'll answer the last first, which is I do have a website that I try to keep up to date, which is miriamevemora.com. Um, and it has, when I post new articles or when publish new articles, I try and keep it updated, and I try and always have, PDF versions of those, so there are no paywalls just linking through. So that's a nice place to keep up on the work. The next project, which I have begun, is an examination of uh, the experiences of Jewish Americans in the public school system around Christmas specifically.
Ah,
There's a lot of
very
working
interesting.
titles. I've I've fiddled with titles like Santa in Schools, The December Dilemma, uh, Jingle Hell. But
Mm.
I'll come up with something that like my previous book title is You Love It or You Hate It. I like punny titles. But the idea behind the book is it's a combination legal history and
Hmm.
social history. So again, looking at those kind of organizations like the JCRC, the ADL, people that field complaints from the community over, violations of the separation of church and state, that sort of
Oh
thing.
yeah. Hmm.
But also a lot of oral testimony and anecdotal, a lot of stories from Jewish Americans about their experiences around Christmas in the public school. And I'm conducting a survey and gathering data from a huge swath of Americans, not just Jews, but a representative sampling, hopefully, to talk about everyone's experience in the public schools and whether or not they felt that diversity efforts were conducive to diversity and how Christmas was received and how the inclusion of Hanukkah changed that. That's really what the new book is going to be about.
It's speaking my language of like education policy, and I'm thinking about like, oh, the school board meeting notes that you could be looking at and all of
Yes.
those kind of things. Yes.
Yes, I mean it started as, it's kind of a personal obsession, just like so many of the things we end up researching. It's a personal obsession, but also I've found a few incidences in the archives, which, of course, because of the personal obsession, those instances jumped out at me. But there are a couple that are truly incredible. It's a
Oh,
pretty, I think it is a near universal experience for Jewish Americans that there's, for them or their children or in their parents' generation, someone was asked to say, play the part of Mary in a nativity play at school, or to sing a Christmas carol with more religious lyrics. Like Jingle Bells, fine, but they were asked to sing Christ in the Manger and got a little, or Little Town of Bethlehem, and got a little uncomfortable. And then someone said something like their mother would go in and say something to the principal or the teacher or the school board or the superintendent and just say, hey, this is making us a little uncomfortable. What's fascinating, and this is really the history that I want to write, is what happens next. So
mm-hmm.
have found these instances where a mother will go and say, hey, maybe we should just stick with the secular carols, but still Christmas carols, but like leave Jesus a little out of it, because my son is suffering from this.
Yeah.
And if someone finds that offensive, and I don't mean this as a joke, but they can raise holy hell. I mean, they go to the press and the families, I've
Mm-hmm.
found instances where families are literally chased out of town, being threatened to
Oh,
be tarred and feathered, where they've escaped in the dead of night, gotten threats, been, reported to the House Un-American Activities Committee in the 1950s. Had their address published in the newspapers nationally and internationally, like one instance in 1949, specifically in Chelsea, Massachusetts. And just because they said, maybe we stick to more secular songs, but the
no.
newspapers chose to publish it as like Jewish family demands ban on Christmas carols. And the backlash is bananas. And so there are lots of instances like this of a school board's decision to not include a Christmas tree. And then someone goes, slightly bananas about it and it gets blown out of proportion and there's an anti-Semitic backlash. And it's
Oh,
fascinating. Sometimes it's from the Jewish community, sometimes it's not. Sometimes the backlash is from the Jewish community, sometimes it's from, the larger kind of mainstream Christian American community. But it's all fascinating and it all revolves around December and it always dies in January.
yeah.
So yeah, that's the and you feel free to trim that down. That was way too
Oh
much,
no,
but I
that's
could
really
talk about this
interesting.
one for hours.
Yeah,
So
that's really interesting, and oh my goodness, you think of this season of like togetherness and inclusivity and joy, and what an interesting parallel and contrast.
it is. It is so strange too, because I think, when I set out on this, my because of the personal obsession, I think I just assumed that I would end up at a place that kind of said, keep, either do like include everything, right? Always include everything. As like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, maybe I could come out with policy recommendations that would actually like use this history to guide secondary school educators. And I think one of the things that I found most surprising is that I don't necessarily believe that anymore. I think that there should be more education about religious history. I think that the
Mm-hmm.
problem is that schools, the problem, yeah. um, teachers are scared to talk about religion in the classroom because they know there's supposed to be a separation of church and state. So they don't talk about religion, which means they don't educate about religion, not teach religion. Teaching religion is what shouldn't happen in the classroom, in the public school classroom.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't educate about what the religions are. Then they say, oh, well, most Americans celebrate Christmas, so we'll celebrate Christmas, which means that they celebrate the holiday without educating about where it came from, what it is, or whose it is. And I think
Yeah.
that's and what proves that out as kind of the flaw, I think, is when they do try to be inclusive, it's done in this very earnest, I think, well-intentioned way, which is, if a mother comes in, say, and says, let's not just do Christmas, they say, great, you come in and teach the kids about Hanukkah. That's not how you
Mm-hmm.
learn about how Jews are. Hanukkah is the least important holiday on the calendar, and the onus of education shouldn't be on the minority group to teach others about them
Right.
anyway. So it's
Right.
well intentioned, but it also pits Christmas against Hanukkah, which is just silly. So I still don't have those policy recommendations, but we'll see where I end up when the book is complete. It should be interesting, I hope, if nothing else.
Yeah, it sounds like a fascinating conversation, and yeah, it sounds like something that someone can take and look at and maybe rethink some policy, and that conversation continues. So, but definitely interesting, nevertheless.
Nice.
Yeah.
I sure hope so.
Yeah, I'll be curious to see how it shapes up. And it has been wonderful to talk with you. I've kept you longer than I promised. Did we miss anything in the conversation that you want to make sure to include before we close out?
Well, I don't think so. This was a total delight. Thank you. I really
Likewise.
appreciated being here, and it's amazing we only ran this far over because I could talk all day about this stuff.
Well, glad to have you back anytime, and glad to be in touch with you. So please keep me posted on the works and development, and certainly glad to share about it here.
Will do. Thank you so much, Jason.